The whistle should have blown 3 minutes ago. David Martinez wiped the sweat from his forehead, his pristine white hard hat doing nothing to shield him from the merciless California sun. As the chief operations manager for the Central Pacific Heritage Railway, he had orchestrated 17 successful vintage locomotive demonstrations without a single hitch. This was supposed to be number 18. Instead, the pride of his career sat motionless on the polished rails like a beached whale made of iron and broken promises. Status report. He barked into his radio, his voice betraying the first cracks of genuine panic. Behind him, a specially constructed grandstand held 300 invited guests, their patience evaporating with each passing minute in the August heat. State senators, museum donors, railway enthusiasts who had flown in from Japan and Germany specifically for this moment. All of them staring at the massive Southern Pacific 4294, a 70-ton articulated steam locomotive that refused to produce so much as a whisper of pressure. The radio crackled back. "We've triple-checked everything, David. The firebox temperature is optimal. Water levels are perfect. Steam lines are clear. She should be building pressure, but the gauge isn't moving past zero." David stared at the motionless beast, his mind racing through every possible explanation. They had spent 14 months restoring this particular engine, stripping it down to the frame and rebuilding every component with obsessive precision. The boiler had been pressure-tested and certified by 3 independent inspectors. The fire was roaring hot enough to make the air shimmer above the smokestack. Yet somehow, impossibly, the locomotive was generating no usable steam pressure. His assistant, a nervous young woman named Kelly, appeared at his elbow with a tablet showing the Twitter feed. "So, people are starting to post videos. It's not good." He glanced at the screen and felt his stomach drop. Someone had already titled their video "Epic Train Fail," and it had 2,000 views in the last 5 minutes. "Get the CEO on the phone," David muttered. "Tell him we might need to issue refunds and reschedule." The words tasted like defeat in his mouth. While chaos consumed the official staging area, an elderly man stood at the edge of the public viewing zone, separated from the locomotive by a chain-link fence and 50 yards of carefully manicured grass. Nobody paid him any attention. He was just another face in the crowd, distinguished only by his age and the remarkable stillness with which he observed the unfolding disaster. Thomas Way was 86 years old. His hands, gnarled and spotted with age, rested calmly on the fence. His eyes, however, were not calm. They moved with the practiced efficiency of a diagnostician, tracking the small details that everyone else was missing. The angle of the smoke from the stack. The faint shimmer of heat distortion above certain sections of the boiler. The way the crew kept clustering around the gauge panel instead of checking the external fittings. He recognized the problem immediately. He had seen it before, decades ago, under very different circumstances. "They are chasing the wrong ghost," he murmured to himself. A young father standing nearby with his son overheard and turned. "Excuse me." Thomas gestured toward the stalled locomotive with one weathered hand. "The pressure. They're looking for a blockage in the steam lines. But that's not where the problem is. The issue is in the feedwater system. Specifically, the injector check valve on the fireman's side. It's stuck in the closed position." The young father blinked, clearly unsure how to respond to this unsolicited technical analysis from a stranger. "Oh, that sounds specific." "It is," Thomas said simply. He had no intention of getting involved. He had learned long ago that offering unasked-for expertise was a quick way to be dismissed as a meddling old man. He was here to watch, to remember, perhaps to feel a connection to machines he had once known intimately. Nothing more. But as he watched the crew descend into increasingly desperate measures, checking and rechecking systems that were functioning perfectly, he felt something stir in his chest. It was not pride or ego. It was something quieter and more fundamental. It was the instinct of a craftsman watching a tool being misused. The minutes stretched into an hour. David Martinez was now visibly frantic, his radio conversations growing sharper and more desperate. The crowd in the grandstand had begun to disperse, people drifting away in clusters, the disappointment palpable. Camera crews from local news stations were packing up their equipment, the story already written in their heads. Restored locomotive fails at grand unveiling. Thomas watched a young technician climb down from the cab, shaking his head. He saw David throw his hard hat to the ground in frustration. He saw the crew begin to discuss how to tow the dead locomotive off the demonstration track. He made a decision. Moving with the careful deliberation of a man who had learned to conserve his energy, Thomas walked along the fence line until he reached a gate marked Authorized Personnel Only. A security guard, a heavy-set man in his 40s, stood blocking the entrance. "Sorry, sir," the guard said automatically. "This area is restricted." "I need to speak with your operations manager," Thomas said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made the guard hesitate. "Sir, they are dealing with a situation right now. I can't let anyone through." Thomas met the guard's eyes. "I know what the situation is. The injector check valve is stuck. It's a common failure point on these older Pacific-class engines when they've been in storage. If your crew doesn't address it in the next 20 minutes, they're going to flood the firebox trying to force-feed water through a closed system." The guard's expression shifted from polite refusal to genuine confusion. "How do you?" "Please," Thomas said simply. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to help." Something in the old man's demeanor, the absolute certainty in his voice, made the guard pull out his radio. "Control, this is Gate 7. I've got a gentleman here who says he knows what's wrong with the locomotive. Says something about a check valve." There was a long pause. Then David Martinez's voice came through, tight with exhaustion. "What's his name?" The guard looked at Thomas expectantly. "Thomas Way." The guard repeated it into the radio. Another pause, this one even longer. Then, "Send him through." The walk across that 50 yards of grass was the longest journey Thomas had taken in years. Every eye in the remaining crowd turned to watch the old man in the faded work jacket making his way toward the stalled locomotive. The news crews, sensing a potential new angle, swiveled their cameras to follow him. David Martinez stood waiting, arms crossed, his expression a mixture of desperation and skepticism. "You're Thomas Way." "I am. And you think you know what's wrong with my locomotive?" "I don't think," Thomas said mildly. "I know. Your injector check valve is stuck closed. The boiler is trying to build pressure, but the feed water system can't inject water into the boiler to replace what's being converted to steam. You're creating a pressure vacuum. That's why your gauge reads 0 even though your fire is hot enough." David stared at him. "The injector system is automated. The sensors would show if there was a blockage. Not if the blockage is mechanical rather than thermal," Thomas countered. "Your sensors are reading temperature and flow rate. They can't detect a stuck valve that's closed but not registering as closed in the system." One of the younger engineers, a woman with oil-stained hands, spoke up. "Even if that's true, the check valves on this model are internal. We'd have to drain the entire boiler to access them. That's a 6-hour process." Thomas shook his head. "Not on a 4294. This particular class has an external access port for the check valves. It's under a maintenance panel on the fireman's side, just behind the third driving wheel. The designers added it specifically because these valves were prone to sticking." The crew exchanged glances. David pulled out a tablet and began scrolling through digital schematics. "I don't see any external access port in these drawings." "That's because you're looking at the civilian operation manual," Thomas said quietly. "The access port I'm talking about was added during wartime modifications. It's not in the standard documentation." The word wartime hung in the air like a gunshot. David lowered his tablet slowly. "What wartime modifications?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked past the assembled crew toward the locomotive, his gait stiff but purposeful. He ran his hand along the massive boiler, his fingers tracing seams and rivets with the familiarity of a man greeting an old friend. He stopped at a specific point behind the third driving wheel and knelt down, his joints protesting the movement. There, barely visible beneath decades of paint and grime, was a small rectangular panel secured with 4 bolts. It was exactly where he said it would be. "There," he said simply. The crew rushed over. David knelt beside Thomas, his skepticism giving way to astonishment. "How did you know this was he?" Thomas looked up at him, and for the first time, David saw something in the old man's eyes that made him pause. It was not pride or smugness. It was memory, deep and heavy as iron. Because I installed it, Thomas said quietly. In 1945, in the Sacramento rail yard, 3 days before we shipped out. The silence that followed was profound. David's assistant, Kelly, had been recording the interaction on her phone. Now she looked down at her screen, her fingers moving rapidly as she searched for something. Her face went pale. "Mr. Martinez," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You need to see this." She held up her phone. On the screen was a scanned military document, yellowed with age. The header read, U.S. Army Transportation Corps, Pacific Theater Technical Bulletin 47B, Field Modifications to SP-4200 Class Locomotive for Combat Zone Operations. Listed among the engineers who had authored the bulletin was a name, Technical Sergeant Thomas Way. David read it twice, then looked up at the old man kneeling beside him. "You were Army Transportation Corps." "I was," Thomas said. 1944 to 1946. We ran supply lines from the coast to the forward staging areas. When the Army realized they needed to move heavy equipment through mountainous terrain, they requisitioned civilian locomotives and modified them for military use. I was part of the team that did the modifications. "Why didn't you say anything?" David asked, his voice thick with emotion. "When you arrived, why didn't you tell us who you were?" Thomas stewed slowly, brushing dirt from his knees. "Because it was 7 to 9 years ago. I didn't think anyone would remember. I didn't think it mattered anymore. Didn't think it mattered." David repeated, incredulous. He gestured at the stalled locomotive. "You're the only person alive who knows how these machines were actually modified. The only one who understands the systems we can't see in the documentation." Thomas gave a small, sad smile. "I'm sure there were others who could have helped. I'm just the one who happened to be here today." "No," David said firmly. "There aren't others. Do you know how many of these locomotives still exist? 12. Do you know how many people are still alive who actually worked on them during the war? We thought it was 0. He stood and faced Thomas fully, and when he spoke again, his voice carried across the demonstration area. "Mr. Way, would you be willing to help us fix this?" Thomas looked at the locomotive, at the crew, at the disappointed crowd beginning to drift back as word spread that something was happening. He thought about walking away, about maintaining his quiet anonymity, about letting the world continue to forget. Then he thought about the young men he had served with, most of them gone now. He thought about the freezing nights in the Sacramento yard, working by flashlight to install these very modifications, knowing that lives would depend on them. He thought about the machines themselves, these iron giants that had carried a nation through its darkest hours. "Yes," he said simply, "I'll help." What happened next would be talked about for years in railway circles. Thomas directed the crew with the quiet confidence of a man who had done this work 1,000 times before. He asked for specific tools, wrenches with odd sizes that the modern crew didn't have in their kits. He described exactly where to apply pressure, how much force to use, the precise sequence of steps needed to free the stuck valve without damaging the delicate components around it. A young engineer named Marcus volunteered to crawl into the tight access space beneath the locomotive. Thomas knelt beside the opening, his voice calm and instructive. "You'll feel the valve housing. It's a brass fitting about the size of your fist. There's a release pin on the top side. You need to tap it 3 times with a rubber mallet, not metal. Metal will shear the pin." "I feel it," Marcus called back, his voice muffled. "There's a lot of scale buildup." "That's the problem," Thomas confirmed. "The scale is binding the valve. Once you tap the pin, use the pick to clear the scale from around the valve seat. Be gentle. That brass is 7 to 9 years old. It's brittle." The crowd had grown silent, watching the old man orchestrate the repair with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. David stood beside Thomas, no longer directing, simply observing. He had the distinct sense that he was witnessing something rare and precious, a connection between past and present that existed in the hands and memory of one man. "I've got it," Marcus called out. "The pin is moving." "Good," Thomas said. "Now apply steady pressure to the valve stem. It should rotate a quarter turn clockwise." There was a moment of silence, then a metallic click that echoed through the locomotive's frame. Immediately, A new sound emerged from deep within the boiler, a rushing, hissing sound that grew steadily in volume. The pressure gauge, which had sat at 0 for over an hour, began to climb. 10 psi, 20, 50. The crew erupted in cheers. The crowd in the grandstand, now swelled with people who had returned when they heard something was happening, rose to their feet in spontaneous applause. David grabbed Thomas by the shoulders, tears streaming down his face. "You did it. My God, you actually did it." Thomas smiled, but his attention was on the locomotive. He watched the pressure gauge climb to operational levels, listened to the familiar sounds of a steam system coming to life, and felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with the applause or recognition. He had helped an old machine remember how to breathe. The story should have ended there, with a triumphant restoration and the cheering crowd. But the universe had one more gift to deliver. As the locomotive finally began to move, its wheels turning with stately power, David received a phone call. His expression changed as he listened, shifting from joy to shock to something approaching awe. He ended the call and turned to Thomas. "Mr. Way, I need to ask you something. Did you ever work on locomotive number 4294 specifically?" Thomas thought for a moment. "It's possible. We worked on dozens of them." "Why?" "Because this is 4294, David said slowly. "And I just got off the phone with our archivist. She's been going through the old maintenance logs we digitized last year. This specific locomotive was modified in Sacramento in March 1945. The lead engineer on the modification crew was listed as Tech Sergeant T. Way." Thomas felt something shift in his chest. He looked at the locomotive with new eyes, really seeing it for the first time. "This is one of mine." "This is one of yours," David confirmed. "You didn't just fix a random locomotive today. You fixed one you built 7 to 9 years ago." The weight of that revelation settled over both men. Thomas reached out and placed his palm flat against the warm metal of the boiler, and in that moment, the years collapsed. He was 23 again, working through the night in a cold rail yard, welding seams and installing valves, never imagining he would live long enough to see his work rolling on rails 8 decades later. "She remembers you," David said quietly. Thomas nodded, unable to speak. The following week, Central Pacific Heritage Railway held a press conference. David stood at a podium, with Thomas seated beside him, and announced the creation of the Thomas Way Memorial Fellowship for Railway Heritage Preservation. It would fund the documentation of wartime modifications and ensure that the knowledge held by the last surviving veterans of the Transportation Corps would be recorded and preserved. But more importantly, they announced that Thomas Way would be honored with something unprecedented, a permanent position as Chief Historical Consultant, with full access to every locomotive in the collection and the authority to guide restoration projects using his first-hand knowledge. The room full of reporters applauded. Camera flashes popped. Questions were shouted. Thomas sat quietly through it all, his weathered hands folded in his lap, his expression peaceful. Later, after the reporters had left and the crowds had dispersed, David found Thomas standing alone beside the 4294, now silent again but ready for its next demonstration. "Penny, for your thoughts," David asked. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "I'm thinking about the boys I served with, the ones who didn't make it home. We built these machines together, all of us. Today felt like I was representing them, making sure their work wasn't forgotten." David nodded, respecting the silence that followed. Finally, Thomas spoke again. "You know what the hardest part of getting old is?" "What's that?" "Watching the world forget. Not maliciously, just forget. The things we built, the things we knew, the reasons we knew them. It all fades. I thought I had made peace with that. But today, standing here, knowing that this machine I helped build is going to keep running, is going to teach new generations." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "Today I realize that maybe we're not forgotten after all." "You're not," David said firmly. "Not anymore. Not ever again." Thomas turned to look at the younger man, and a small smile touched his lips. "Then I suppose I'd better get busy. We've got 11 more locomotives that need proper documentation, and I'm not getting any younger." David laughed, the sound full of joy and relief. "I'll clear my schedule." The final scene of our story takes place 3 months later. The The 4294 is making its inaugural heritage run, a 50-mile journey along a restored section of historic track through the Sierra Nevada foothills. The passenger cars are filled with railway enthusiasts, historians, and families who have come to experience living history. In the cab of the locomotive, David Martinez stands beside the controls, his hands on the throttle. Seated in the engineer's chair, moving through the motions of monitoring gauges and adjusting valves with a muscle memory of a lifetime, is Thomas Way. He's not actually driving. The locomotive is still under David's control. But he's there, in the place he belonged 7 to 9 years ago, feeling the rumble of the engine through the floor, hearing the symphony of hisses and clanks that mean a steam locomotive is healthy and strong. As they round a bend and the afternoon sunlight streams through the cab windows, Thomas closes his eyes and remembers. He remembers the cold Sacramento nights and the desperate urgency of wartime. He remembers the young men he served with, their faces now faded but their voices still clear in his memory. He remembers the pride they took in their work, the knowledge that they were building something important, something that would matter. And now, impossibly, miraculously, here he is again, still mattering, still teaching, still serving. The whistle blows, long and clear, echoing off the granite walls of the canyon. Thomas Way opens his eyes and smiles. The story of Thomas Way and Locomotive 4294 reminds us that expertise is not just in the manuals we read or the technology we master, but in the hands and minds of those who built our world. True knowledge doesn't come with an expiration date. If this story moved you, please like this video, share it with someone who appreciates history, and subscribe to True Vela Veteran for more incredible stories of unsung heroes who shaped our world.